for the opportunity. As you well know, Iraq prior to 2003, mainly during the time of Saddam Hussein's regime from 1979 to 2003, turned gradually into a pariah state. Saddam Hussein and his regime did not have a single friend in the decent world. Maybe he had some friends who looked like him and acted like him, but he was in a way engaged in many destructive policies, both domestically and internationally. And that led to dragging Iraq into this hostility from the entire world, and it facilitated the decision to finally invade the country by the United States and its allies in the coalition in 2003, after several wars and sanctions that were imposed by the United Nations on Iraq, probably the harshest sanctions regime that was put on any country by the UN, and it crippled the nation economically, socially, and in many aspects. So by 2003, Iraq was an easy target for anyone who cared to go and invade it, and the United States took upon itself that task. So what happened, of course, the U.S. invasion to Iraq happened without an authorization from the United Nations, but there were many UN resolutions that restricted Iraq's ability to behave and to act as a fully sovereign state. Those mainly started from the invasion of Kuwait, which was again deemed by the United Nations as a violation of the international law, and then many of these resolutions that were supposed to force Saddam Hussein's regime to leave Kuwait were transferred later for other purposes, mainly to force Iraq to give up its arsenal of weapons of mass destruction, which Iraq took upon itself to do it. But the United Nations latched on Iraq in a way, and it's very hard to get out of UN sanctions once you get into them. They are easy to get into, but they are hard to get out of. And those sanctions that lasted between 1990 and 2003, some of them actually continued even post-2003, as we will probably discuss. They were used in a way to control Iraq, to shape Iraq the way certain Western countries, led by the United States, the way they wanted Iraq to be for the future. And a lot of course, associated with these resolutions, a lot of corruption was occurring. Anybody who could go back and look, for example, to the oil for food program that the United Nations put together, was clearly a very corrupt program that involved a lot of siphoning of the money, or even bribes and kickbacks, and all of that were used by companies and even by personalities associated with the UN and their personnel. So there were no clean hands, whether from the Iraqi regime or the United Nations system. However, as I mentioned, the invasion of Iraq, finally, the decision to change the regime did not earn the approval and the authorization from the United Nations. So there were some resolutions that could allow the United States to act, and there are other or there were other areas where there were no UN resolutions that would authorize the US to act. So the United States had a combination of authorization frameworks. One of them is the UN, as I mentioned, with the existing resolutions. The other were executive orders from the US presidents and based on certain United States laws. Congress passed several laws to authorize the president to use force. There are also certain provisions in the US Constitution that would allow the US president to act in certain contingencies and emergencies. There are laws that were or resolutions that were passed to including the authorization of the actions in Iraq. All of these were used as a background, a legal background, or basis to put together some of these orders, including what was called Order 13303, which is what we are talking about here. That was issued by President Bush in 2003. It has a package of carrots and sticks. That's what I think what the resolution is. The carrots is that it was protecting Iraqi assets from being seized or claimed in court by people who have claims that they were damaged or they were hurt by financially or otherwise by the actions of the regime of Saddam Hussein. And at the time, even though Saddam was responsible for those and his government, but Iraq at the end of the day ended up being inheriting those liabilities from the regime, even after it fell, which is the nature of international relations. The death of a dictator or a president or leader of state, or his departure from power does not absolve the country and the people from any action. So there is this part, which is as I said, the carrots were to make sure that Iraq would not be paying for anybody who claims that they were damaged by the actions of Saddam Hussein. And the reason for this is not to deny those claimants any kind of retribution, but to say, well, Iraq needs those assets to rebuild and to rehabilitate itself and go back to become a full member or a conducive member of the international community. The other part of this also, again, and I'm talking about the carrots here, the things that are positive and the decisions and what happened after 2003. There was an effort that was led by by the United States, and actually the person who led that in 2003, 2004 was a friend of mine named Mr. Olin Wethington, who was an official at the Coalition of Professional Authority, who was working towards dropping or forgiving some of the debt that Iraq incurred during Saddam Hussein's regime. Mr. Wethington and a team of Iraqis and non-Iraqis spoke with the Paris Club, for example, and countries that held a lot of Iraqi debt at the time, and they dropped more than between 100 and 120 billion dollars of Saddam Hussein's debt was forgiven at the time. A huge accomplishment, which allowed Iraq to again start with a clean sheet after 2003, and the new government would be able to function. The only things that were not under protection or forgiveness were, of course, things that had to do with UN resolutions that the other parties did not want to forgive the debt, and major among those was Kuwait. Iraq, according to the UN resolutions, Iraq had to pay or make several actions or take several actions to take back the damage that was caused to Kuwait from the 1990 invasion. and they basically partly was paying the reparations for the damages from the invasion itself that amounted to more than $52 billion. And Iraq continued to pay that over somewhere around 18, 19 years until finally Iraq ended up paying all of that. I think Iraq is the only country in history that paid all UN-imposed reparations, financial reparations on it. And again, it was about 52 billion. That was what Resolution 1483, which ended the sanctions that are associated with Kuwait. And it was just a couple of years ago. I don't recall the exact date, but you could just go back to it and see what 1483 is about. Then, of course, that money continued because Kuwait insisted to receive every penny of it, and Iraq paid it. There were other debts here and there, but insignificant compared with what was owed to Kuwait, where countries ended up still claiming their money, and like Iraq, no different than many other countries, that they have to have a lot of exchange of debt and credit with other nations. There was some, Saudi Arabia ended up having some claim that the money they gave to Iraq to conduct the war against Iran, which Saddam understood that they were their share of contribution. They ended up later saying, no, these were debts, and this is a dispute until now is going on between Iraq and Saudi Arabia, several other countries like that. But in general, that is what the executive order was to protect Iraq against claims by companies and individuals who still claim reparations that were not paid, and to make sure that what was called Iraq Development Fund, which is the money were put in a bank account that during oil for food and all of that was helped to put Iraq together. On the stick side, of course, is basically the resolution allows the United States to impose sanctions on individuals and even on the country if they so wish, and on groups, on parties, etc. And also, at the end of the day, the resolution is a national emergency resolution, or executive order, I should say. The executive order is an emergency executive order, which means that anything that the U.S. president or the U.S. government deems as necessary to maintain the stability of Iraq and to protect U.S. national security as far as Iraq concerned, they are authorized to take action towards that, which means Iraq, while it is out of UN resolutions right now, most of the UN resolutions that forced Iraq to do anything between 1990 and 2003 or even beyond are gone now. Iraq is not under the Chapter 7 of the UN Charter, Iraq not under any other UN Security Council resolutions that are forcibly asking Iraq to do anything. But those executive orders, as far as the US is concerned, are still active. And this is one of them. And basically, the US can go back on those US laws to take unilateral actions, whether it's sanctions or it is some other actions. And let's remember that at the end of the day, the United States holds a huge leverage on Iraq when it comes to the economy. The dollars, which we could talk about, basically are an asset of the U.S. government that they can deny Iraq any shipments of dollars, etc. But sanctions basically is the major leverage the United States has under this resolution. Sorry, it's the longest answer, but it's basically to give you sort of an idea of what the framework and what the what the moving targets are of this executive order. Go ahead.
So our next question was more regarding the U.S. presences in Iraq since 2003. Was it only military, or does it have a 360-degree intervention of the U.S. in the economy, politics, social, and so on?
No, there is no 360 degree, as you well know. But I think it is also a mistake to call it only military. I'm not saying that you are making this mistake, but many people tend to view the mistake or the military side of the relation and not look at those. And I will explain why. But before that, my good friend Dr. Hassan Nadem, who is a well-known Iraqi intellectual and happened to be a minister of Iraqi Ministry of a minister of culture in Iraq in the last government, accuses me of a profound speaker. He says, you are like Castro. He speaks for 6 hours, then he would go with his friend. I think he was referring to his talks with Marquise, and he said, once they speak for 5-6 hours, then they go to the door, and then he ends up speaking with him for 3 more hours at the door. So, and I don't want to take your time because these are good questions, and sometimes they merit elaboration. If you don't have time, just cut me off anytime.
Oh no, we have all the times. I have my opinion just for you. So
yeah. So basically, that's where we are. Let's go back to what we were saying. So your question was whether it was a military, lopsided military relation, or it had some other aspects. The U.S.-Iraqi engagement in 2003 began as an invasion. So by definition, it was a military action, and it was a military case. The government of the United States, having decided to change the Iraqi regime by the use of force, not having UN resolution to authorize that, decided to do it unilaterally, well, in a way multilaterally, with the coalition that went with it, Britain and several other countries that were called the Coalition of the Willing. And immediately after the invasion, all of the state of Iraq melted away. So what we had was a military government, American military government of Iraq for a while. And then in around May of 2003, the US established a civilian administration of Iraq called the Coalition Provisional Authority, CPA for short. And that CPA was led by a retired US ambassador by the name of Paul Bremer. And Bremer basically handpicked a number of Americans to help him out. And also, some of them had experience in Iraq, some of them had no experience. Bremer himself had no experience other than the 2 weeks of briefs that he had in Washington before he headed to Iraq, which is what he says in his book about 1 year in Iraq. And then also they handpicked a number of Iraqis, mainly Iraqis who lived in the United States at the time, or Iraqis who lived in other European countries or elsewhere, who had connections with the Americans that were involved in running Iraq. That administration pretty much governed Iraq in 360 degrees of any affairs of Iraq, to a point where Bremer sometimes would forget himself and speaks about Iraq in the first personal pronoun. We are doing this, and our neighbors, until he was told one day, who the heck are you talking about Iraq and saying we? But again, as I mentioned, one of the things about me is even when I criticize, I take myself back to the objective position, not all the CPA actions were bad. Some of them were quite good. I just mentioned one to you earlier, the dropping of $120 billion of Iraq debt. That was a huge accomplishment by a CPA person, who Mr. Withington, who was holding the economic dossier for the CPA. But be that as it may, Bremer issued his own directives and acted like basically the sole authority in Iraq. He, for example, dismantled all of the Iraqi military institutions. And here I'm not making judgment of right or wrong. I'm just saying what he was doing. He dismantled most of the civilian institutions of the state under Saddam Hussein regime. And he ended up trying to say, we will establish new ones for that. But he had a number of directives that were pretty much dismantled the Iraqi state and began to rebuild or put together new institutions. Later on, under many pressures from inside Iraq and the international community, he ended up putting a mask on the CPA by selecting a number of Iraqi opposition leaders and creating what was called the Governing Council. And that Governing Council, which is selected based on diversity of ethno-sectarian groups, and took representatives from those, and they were supposed to lead Iraq under the CPA, with Bremer being the final or the highest arbiter. It's, in a way, I mentioned that I wrote about the British experience in Iraq. It was similar to what Sir Percy Cox did during the mandate time. The government would have ministers, but the ministers have advisors who are British. Now the advisors are Americans. And the Council of Ministers, when there is a disagreement or a dispute or they don't know what to do, they ended up going to Sir Percy Cox in the 1920s. In 2000, they would go to Paul Bremer, and he held a veto basically on the decisions of the Governing Council. And that lasted until the writing of the Transitional Administrative Law, the TAL, and it was adopted, and power was transferred according to it to the Iraqis on June 28, 2004. That 1 year, basically, or so, it ended up, after that, a government was handpicked under Prime Minister Iyad Allawi, who was the head of he held the only prime minister in post 2003 who held executive and legislative authority. There was no parliament. And then, of course, it led to the writing of the constitution and an election of a constitutional commission or they call it a constituent assembly that wrote the constitution. The constitution was adopted in 2005. And then we had an election, and then the first Iraqi constitutional government of Nour al-Maliki came in 2006, and we held, elections since then. The U.S. role between 2003 and 2011, when they withdrew the last soldier after that, was basically had phases. One phase was the CPA, when the United States was basically doing everything for Iraq, from the economy to the laws to the legislation to the picking the garbage, and everything basically was that's your 360-degree kind of metaphor, is where the US was doing everything. Even when they had Iraqis who were, a governing council, but there were no institutions that were, those Iraqis were not connected all the way to the people by a stratification of institutions that would go from, the governing council to ministries to the even when they had ministries after June 2004 under Iyad Allawi. Still, most of these ministries, some of them didn't even have a place to to sit. They were just sitting in the government palace in the green zone. Many of them were targeted. If you worked for the Iraqi state under the Americans, you were a target of many of those, self-appointed resistance groups that were killing everybody. And it was a nice excuse for them to say we are killing him or her because they are working for the occupation force. The United States, of course, called itself the occupation force. They introduced language to the UN Security Council. The United States did, calling themselves an occupation. So basically, that led to all kinds of, legal mess. Because once you call yourself an occupation, you acknowledge that the people have a right to, resist this occupation, demand the occupation to end. It was, again, an issue that we could talk about if you like. But at the end of the day, the US moved from doing everything to doing everything with an Iraqi signature. But the US still did everything under the governing council. And then with the CPA being, the actual power, to the US being, as the government of Iyad Allawi was formed, as I said, it was a government that held both legislative and executive powers. When they wanted to do something, they used a lot of the times US tools, whether they are military or civilian tools, to execute their daily duties. Now, under the government of Iyad Allawi, we started seeing a little bit of Iraqi activity in governing the country. Iraq was resuming the export of oil, so some revenue was coming, and that money was spent, not US money. There was also, because on paper sovereignty was delivered to the Iraqis on June 28, 2003, that government was supposed to be sovereign. But again, it was sovereign with 150,000 troops, US troops and coalition troops there. And mostly all of the military operations were done by the United States, including the activity of building a new Iraqi army. So they had to recruit a new Iraqi military and train it and equip it and all of that. And the slogan that was going on during that time, as the Iraqis stand up, the US will sit down. In other words, every task the Iraqis are capable of doing, the US will stop doing it. The transfer of power was gradual as the Iraqis have enough expertise and capabilities to do it. Until probably around the years of 2007, 2008, maybe, we started seeing real Iraqi sort of government going on, and the Iraqis were somehow practicing that power under the tutelage of the United States, and that was towards the end of President Bush's time in 2008. And Iraq was deemed strong enough or sovereign enough to enter in some kind of an agreement with the United States. And that's when they signed two major agreements. One of them was the State of Forces Agreement of 2008 and the Strategic Framework Agreement. The Strategic Framework Agreement was supposed to be open-ended. Doesn't have an expiration date, and until today, it is the only agreement that governs the relationship between Iraq and the United States. And until recently, it was the only agreement Iraq had with another nation after 2003. But last month, Turkey signed another agreement called Strategic Framework. So now we have two, and we hope to see more. But still, this is important. The second one was, as I said, the Status of Forces Agreement, which gave the United States an authority to be in Iraq until 2011, the end of 2011, and left it to the two countries to agree on whether the US would stay or leave after the expiration of the treaty, which meant that if the US were to stay, they had to come up with a permanent agreement of status of forces. And the negotiations continued. Now, in 2009 on, there was a change of US administration. President Obama was in power, and President Obama made it a campaign promise that he would withdraw the forces from Iraq. So from his side, he wanted to sound that he was telling the truth to his constituencies, and he was going to face new elections in 2012. On the other hand, the Iraqi government so Obama had a big incentive not to stay, even though there was a pressure from inside the United States that it is in the interest of the US to stay militarily. On the other hand, the Iraqis also were having this wound of national pride, if you will, that Iraqis are occupied, even though on paper it was delivered sovereignty to the Iraqis, did everything by the book. The UN acknowledged that Iraq is a sovereign state, but the de facto things on the ground, there were 840,000, 150,000 troops in Iraq calling the shots. So the Iraqis understood, especially within the regional pressures from neighboring countries, Iran, the Gulf, others, they called Iraq as occupied country, even though, again, the UN did not, the occupation officially ended in June 2004. So the only way for Iraq to gain full sovereignty was to send away the last soldier of the American troops outside the country. And Noor al-Maliki said, that is how we are going to do it. We want our sovereignty back, and we will do it the hard way. And the two countries did not agree, or the two governments did not agree on the terms of the US staying beyond December of 2011. So since a new agreement was not signed, that they let the 2008 status of force agreement to expire without an agreement. The US held its word and withdrew. And then they didn't come back until 2014, as you well know, with the ISIS invasion of several provinces in Iraq. Back to your question, this is all to give you the context. So what was the nature of the US involvement? The US was involved initially, moved from doing everything on the economy and on the governance of Iraq to delivering those responsibilities gradually and holding some that Iraq still could not do, until when the Iraqi government was fully functioning and thinking that they were ready to move without the US. The US held certain capabilities to provide aid for Iraq, mainly through USAID, which is a very important organization that provides support for Iraq. A lot of it is training. And here I'm talking not about the military, the other issues, whether it's in reconstruction, whether it is in building capacity, whether it is in providing money for NGOs, taking care of some projects, training Iraqi leaders, a lot of things that were done under the umbrella of the USAID. Now, you might ask then, why are people looking only at the military? First, because the military has louder voice. The guns always draw more attention than the soft power. But on the other hand, also, and this is true, and that's, I don't know whether it's a mistake of the United States or a calculated strategy, they did not want to advertise what they were doing in Iraq. US aid was working a lot of the time in silence. A lot of it was because they didn't want their personnel who are doing the work on the ground to be targeted. There are so many other calculations, but basically, a lot of the projects were either done in an invisible way, or sometimes they are done even under different umbrellas like the UN or some organizations that are done, in collaboration, but it is US money that is being put together. The US also partnered with a lot of other allies to do work. So, and until today, the United States is spending a fair amount of money in Iraq. It's still the largest donor to Iraqi reconstruction until today, through USAID and through other organizations in this. But the strategic framework agreement, which really is supposed to give you that 360 degrees of relations, was not implemented well in that sense. The agreement has several aspects of it. The military is one, and security, but also there was a talk about cooperation and technology transfer and cultural issues and economic issues and trade and in education and a lot of aspects. But either the United States was not in a position to provide some of that according to the agreement, or the Iraqis failed to go to the US and say, give us this, we have an agreement, remember? So that's basically what happened. And until recently, the Iraqi prime minister was in Washington just a month ago, and I interviewed him at the Atlantic Council basically in a public event we held for him. And he did say that his visit was mainly to make sure that the agreement is fully enforced in all its aspects, to the point where he basically made it clear that he did not accompany with him any security or military person in the delegation. All the delegation was economic, cultural, and trade, and and the whole schedule of his visit had nothing to do with the military side. It was more about those other aspects of the strategic framework agreement that he wanted to have. So there is an agreement between the two governments that they need to move beyond the military and they need to go there. What they did, and it is, I think, clever, they established a joint committee, US and Iraqi committee or US coalition committee, to work the security arrangements. And Iraq ended up basically declaring that they want to end the work of the coalition and turn it into a bilateral agreement between the United States and Iraq, between other countries in the coalition and Iraq. And this way, they opened a good space on the table of negotiations for the rest of the 360 degrees, with the economy, with the trade, with the education, with the technology, with agriculture, and all transportation, and all other sectors that didn't receive enough attention. And that also is logical because Iraq right now is very stable when it comes to security. It's actually facing an unprecedented time of stability and security, so they can move to the other aspects without having to be under the fear of being attacked. We are not like we were in the first 10 years after the invasion, or even in 2014, where Iraqi army melted away. The Iraqi military right now is in strong position. They have good experience in fighting terrorism and other. Still, Iraq probably is not able to defend itself against an invasion from a powerful neighbor, But that also is not on the horizon, because I don't think anyone is going to invade Iraq. So the Iraqis are in good shape in that aspect. So they are freeing some of their time and some of their energy to put it on the non-military side of the relations with the rest of the world.
The 360 partnership that you spoke of was actually a key feature of the recent meeting that took place between President Biden and Prime Minister Soudani last April, and they also came out with the joint declaration, I think, a week ago. And so we're wondering, in general, what would you say the implications are for what the relationship looks like right now and going into the future?
Well, the United States is making it no secret that they do not trust the Iraqi government. For two reasons. One of them is they see that the relation between the Iraqi government and Iran is too close. And this is, for the United States, is a priority. The United States' main policy is not about Iraq. Even the Iraq policy in the State Department is mainly an attachment to the larger policy of the region, where Iran is the main feature. During the Trump administration, for example, they combined the Iraq desk and the Iran desk under the same deputy assistant secretary, and for the first time that I know, and at least in recent memory, where Iraq desk and Iran desk were combined under the same leadership. Then, towards the end of the Trump administration, they decoupled those. And then Biden came and recombined them. So now the deputy assistant secretary, who is, well, she's Victoria Taylor, who is handling the Iraq dossier, is also handling the Iran dossier, which tells you basically, if there is this case, then the work is 80% Iran, 20% Iraq. I'm just, making estimates. I don't sit with them in the desk, but I have fair good communication with the way State Department does its work, but the focus is really mainly on Iran. So Iraq, whether in all the US sort of estimates of how Iraq government is behaving, is based on their relation with Iran. From Iraq's side, the Iraqis say, well, look, we have 1,000 kilometers, more than 1,000 kilometers, 1,400 kilometers actually, between Iraq and Iran as a border. Iraq and Iran are joined economically, culturally, religiously, and there's no way you can really, this is not a house you sell and move. This is a country, and they will be our neighbors. They've been our neighbor for 8,000 years, and they will be neighbors until God knows when. So basically, they are not leaving, and we are not leaving. So we have to deal with this neighbor. Also, there are necessities. Iraq, for example, Iraqi electricity, which is the difference between the government staying in power or being taken out by the people, is how much electricity they give, especially in summer. As we speak now, Iraq is moving towards 50 degrees centigrade during the day. And the gas that operates the Iraqi generators comes from Iran. This is one thing. The Iraqis go to Iran for medical treatment. There's a lot of trade. Iran is the third trade partner with Iraq. And also Iranians go to Iraq for pilgrimage, and they go for so many other, and it's the two countries are too much intertwined, actually, even to the normal. But that's the way it is. What made Iran have the upper hand, of course, was a decision by Arab countries not to engage with Iraq for a number of years, and Iran filled that vacuum. So Iraq looks around, and Turkey and Iran are the two major partners. Now Saudi is coming back to the Iraqi market. So in general, the United States is perplexed by this relationship between the Iraqi government and the Iranian government. And while some of the US officials understand that, this is not something you can disengage from, and Iraqi government has to deal with the Iranians, they think that There are groups in Iraq that are more loyal to Iran than Iraq, and these groups are holding key powerful positions in the country. And therefore, for the US sanctions and pressures on Iran to work, they need Iraqi cooperation, and they feel that Iraq is not cooperating enough to help the US objectives to pressure Iran to behave in a way the US wants. They can get several other countries to do what they want, but Iraq is still very hard to do it. And again, most of it is the US ends up having to cave in because the Iraqis will come back and throw their hands and say, well, look, there is nothing we can do. We need Iranian gas. Give us waivers to buy. In order to do that, we need to pay them money. So allow us to pay Iran money, even though you have them under sanctions. In order to do this, we need to. So without Iran, the Iraqi government makes it seem that, they cannot function. And that frustrates the United States. I've been in many meetings, informal meetings, and also sessions of discussion, etc., here where the U.S.'s government is involved. And, it's what we do. And basically, you see the frustration up in the air when this talk happens, because on the one hand, the US wants Iraq to comply and cooperate. On the other hand, they realize that Iraq cannot. Iraq is not still independent enough, especially financially and logistically, to be able to tell Iran, we are going to close those 1,400 kilometers and let them go. And even, quite frankly, if Iraq is able to do that, the US is right. There are groups in Iraq and individuals, politicians, and leaders who believe that, this is something, the problem of the United States. Why should we inherit it? Just a little digression. Nelson Mandela one day was asked by somebody, here you are, a great defender of human rights. You revolted against an authoritarian regime, an apartheid regime, and look at your friends. Most of them are brutal dictators, from Gaddafi to this, to that, to that. And the journalist felt like he cornered Mandela. Mandela looked at him and he said, what your problem is? Your problem in the West is that you think your enemies should be our enemies. And that's really a problem here. The Iraqis say, well, the US looks at Iran as its enemy. Why should we, for American calculations, believe that or act as if Iran is the Iraqi enemy? So from, it depends on where you look, where you sit, you look at this relationship. If you sit in Washington, yeah, it makes sense. Iraq should pressure Iran because Iran is this bad actor, etc. But if you are in Iraq, you say, well, this is a different stuff. So basically, that's where it is. The US doesn't trust the Iraqis as to rise up to the level of full ally. At best, they are friend. And at worst, according to American politicians, some American politicians, they are a frenemy. One moment they are friend, one moment they are enemy. Or some people are friends in the Iraqi power positions and others are enemies. And Iraqis are not making a secret out of this. Many of them come out on TV and call the United States the enemy. And some others are doing the opposite. Some of them do it in a duplicitous way. They talk to the Americans in a friendly way and they talk to the Iranians in a friendly way. And, these are people who are feeling their way and understanding how to conduct their politics, because many of them did not run a primary school before they were given ministries and countries to run, and that's another issue. So, Iraqi transition towards this new states of politics and state of affairs is a messy journey. It's getting better, but we are still having a long way to have that clarity, and for Iraq and the Iraqi political elite to act as a sophisticated, leadership that would understand its objectives and obligations.
Okay, so from this insight, you've talked about Iran, but you've talked also about this possible anti-US, anti-Western sentiment from the Iraqi society, but also the government. Do you see a path toward a more balanced relationship between Iraq, Iran, and the US in the future, but also how the Iraqi government is balancing this anti-Western sentiment from the people, but also some member of the government?
Well, look, low approval ratings of the United States, if I were to put it politely, it's not just in Iraq, it's all over the world. I mean, probably, the demonstrations against the US are, in Boston and Berkeley and US cities are even stronger than what you see in Iraq.
Yeah.
It's US government policies sometimes do put people in a hard position where they have no choice but to reject those policies. So that's one thing. The US already is having an uphill battle because all of the region in the Middle East are regions are countries that carry the legacy of colonization on their backs, and even the decolonization process was not a pleasant one. Until now, there are grievances that are still standing. If you think about it, and this is something probably close to home. You see it when you look at the relation between Algeria and France, for example, or the Palestinians and the UK, the Iraqis and the UK, and America is the new kid on the block when it comes to this international meddling in the region. And the post World War II, the United States heavily became present, as you well know. Until World War II, the US left the Middle East as a British and French sphere of influence, while they occupied themselves elsewhere. But after that, with the decline of the British power and the withdrawal of France as an empire, basically, you started seeing that the US was filling that vacuum, especially in places where the oil is, or trade routes, strategic places, etc. So, in general, the US is having a problem everywhere. Iraq is in particular because the US invaded Iraq. The US wounded the pride of Iraqis and the pride of Iraqis in many ways. The invasion of the US and the post-invasion time had too many mistakes to mention and too many atrocities, and they were compounded over the time. No invasion is a clean cut, but also this was particularly careless and particularly injurious to the Iraqi pride, and that is something the US has to live with, and that is an issue you have to reckon with. So in general, back to your question, is how would the Iraq, Iran, and the United States can sort of move forward? Well, it's easy. I think one way to do it, which is what I advocated all the time here in Washington, is kind of against your question, is not to think about it as Iraq, Iran, and the United States collectively trying to solve it, because then you are complicated the problem. My proposal always is to separate Iraq problems with the US from Iran's problems with the United States. Then you can easily tackle those rather than compounding them, because then you will end up to mutually exclusive solutions. What you need to do is really to treat Iraq as an individual state, approach this as a bilateral relation, which is what the Iraqi government is trying to do, is to not complicate these problems by putting them in a multilateral session or setting. And that is where I think what we need to do is to go back and take Iraq into, back to its individual state, of, and then as a sovereign state, as a state with its unique interests, unique national objectives, and then deal with Iraq as a United States, as a United Kingdom, as a France, as etc. And that is where we really need to see it. We need to simplify the issue rather than complicate it by adding other parties. Because then you will bring problems that Iraq is not necessarily interested in or party of, which is what Iraq did. Again, part of your question was, what did the Iraqi government do to sort of make this easy on itself? The Iraqi government began, again, I am different than the conventional wisdom. A lot of people think that Iraq departed from the Arab, region. It is not true. It's the Arabs who abandoned Iraq. Initially, they abandoned Iraq when Saddam Hussein was in power. And I understand that because Saddam was an aggressive dictator. But they acted in a schizophrenic way. When Saddam was toppled, they got mad that he was toppled. And, and because they didn't like the government that took over after him, it's different. In a sectarian way. I mean, they belong to different sect of the Muslim religion, but they ended up boycotting Iraq. And indeed, if anything, they ended up supporting all of the destabilizing acts that were coming, whether through private money or with government money. And in my mind, one Saudi Riyal cannot exit Saudi without the government looking the other way. So there is no real separation between when they wanted to stop that, they stopped it. And whether it's Kuwait, whether it's Saudi Arabia, whether it is, several other countries in that case, they were part of this problem. They abandoned Iraq and they did not want to get involved or engaged with the Iraqi government, and that gave the upper hand to the two other countries that are competitors in this case to the Arab, which is Turkey and Iran. And infrastructure for relations, whether it's trade, whether it is economic relations, social relations, etc., was established between 2003 and 2014-15. Now, some countries in the Gulf, especially, began to open up to Iraq earlier. Kuwait, despite the problems and the legacy of the Iraqi invasion of 1990, opened up to Iraq fairly early. The UAE came around a little bit later, but it was. Qatar was okay with Iraq for quite a while. Oman was always in good relation with Iraq. Bahrain, because of the uniqueness of the situation of the Bahrain and its sectarian relations, it remained, and also Bahrain ended up being close to Saudi policies, but Saudi was the hardest block for any kind of normalization. And Iraq was okay. Many Iraqi politicians said, well, thank you. You don't want to be here. We have Iran, we have Turkey. And that's what they wanted anyway, many of the people in Iraqi politics. But something happened in 2015 after the failure of ISIS, or everybody knew that this last ditch fight against the new Iraqi regime was going to collapse, and that ISIS failed to accomplish its objectives. Everybody realized that this new regime in Iraq is not going anywhere, and it's better to join it if you cannot beat it. And I think the resilience of the Iraqi political system forced a change. Also, there was a change in Saudi Arabia, the death of King Abdullah, the rise of King Salman, mostly through his son Mohammed bin Salman. They ended up looking at it differently, and they said, well, look, it is useless to continue to hope that Iraqi regime will collapse and a friendly regime will be established. Why don't we turn this regime into a friendly regime? And the Iraqi government said, yes, we are willing to turn the chapter and open. And it was the same prime minister, Haider Abadi, who early in his administration stood and said, Saudi Arabia sent us 5,000 suicide bombers who killed Iraqis in markets. He was the one who was there when the relation changed and an Iraq and a Saudi embassy was opened in Baghdad. And he visited Saudi Arabia, and then the relations began to warm up. Initially, it was a bumpy road. They sent a military intelligence guy as an ambassador. He ended up being expelled from Iraq, but later on they sent a more professional one, and the relation took off. And in a combination of trade, social relations, sports. When the Saudi team went to Iraq and played, Iraqis split their audience into two halves. Bunch of Iraqis were supporting the Iraqi team and the other supporting the Saudi team. So they gave them a warm welcome and so many other things. Ended up really normalizing these relations. Iraq, since the government of Haider al-Abadi, took a new doctrine of regional politics, which is basically being positively neutral, that they would move from away from any axis politics. They are not in the camp of Saudi Arabia. They are not in the camp of Iran. When there are disputes and issues or conflicts that Iraq is no party to, they said, we are not going to support this side or that side. We are going to. And then they moved even more on this positivity to become a mediator. And they ended up actually taking a leading role, for example, in the restoration of the relations between Saudi and Iran, for example. They were talking about even trying to get some other countries, Jordan and others, and Egypt, to talk to Iran, because the Iraqis were in a unique position, talking both to Iran and to its opponents. Only Iraq and Oman have this ability. Then, of course, they even hosted the nuclear negotiations between the United States and the 5+1, basically, and then Iran on the other side, and that led to something very helpful before Trump came and erased everything. But in general, Iraq now is seen as a country that doesn't really have enemies in the international relations. You cannot point at any country and say this country is an enemy of Iraq. There are groups like ISIS and others, etc. There are individuals here and there, but there is no country that is considered to be Iraq's enemy officially. And compare that with before 2003, where Iraq did not have a single friend other than, of course, North Korea, and well, there's a couple of other countries based in North Korea, and some of the people like North Korea in a way, who were close to Iraq, Cuba, and others. But in general, that's a huge change in how Iraq is projecting itself regionally and internationally. The UN resolutions that took Iraq out of Chapter 7 were all of them speaking positively about Iraq as a country that took its responsibilities and that lived up to their promises, and they are trying to turn the chapter on the previous problems that Iraq had under previous regimes. So that all should help in a way. And as we speak today, the only problems that Iraq is entangled in are problems, I'm talking about international relations, are problems that are not related to Iraq. Iran hates Saudi Arabia, Saudi Arabia hates Iran, and they decide, instead of launching missiles at each other, they decide to fight in Iraq. Or Iran and Israel does something. Iran and America have problems. Instead of hitting each other, they find it convenient that to fight in Iraq, and the Iraqi government is caught in the crossfire without a reason for it to be involved and without an ability to be disengaged. And that's the only thing that is remaining for Iraq to really deal with. And it is, in a way, it's becoming much less. We are nowhere near, for example, what happened in 2019, 2020, where the US and Iran engaged in real war on Iraqi soil. We are nowhere near the early years of 2000s when Saudi Arabia and Iran were waging terrorist war on Iraqi soil between themselves and their proxies. So this is basically, the prospects look much better now.
Yeah. And in the intern relation in the country, what do you think about the possible return of Muqtada Assad, in particular with his party name, the Shiite National Movement, and his ties with Iran, and also in the context of the continuation of the American decree in Iraq? What do you think?
Well, Muqtada Sadr is an important player in Iraqi politics. He is the only one with a strong and stable constituency. His supporters are very loyal, very dedicated. They believe in their cause, and they are big. And in the last election, they won 73 seats of the Iraqi parliament, the highest of any group. Also before that, they had the election of 2018. They were also coming as number one. They are strong in that way. However, they are not enough to govern the country. No one has enough power to govern Iraq or to move Iraq. Iraqis are destined under the current system, because it's not a presidential system. So in parliamentary politics, Iraq will always be fragmented into groups that none of them basically can, on their own, have enough seats in a democratic setting to run the country. They have to make coalitions. And those coalitions sometimes boil down to two things. One of them is party interests. Rarely national interests play a number, or personal interests of everybody who is involved in those. And that's the problem. So Muqtada Sadr, while he's very important, he can block any kind of action, but he cannot force action, and that's the problem. He cannot democratically force an action because he has not enough. I mean, 73 out of the 329 member, that's not anywhere near what you need to have a majority, right? You need 160 something, right? Around that, 165, 166 to be able to conduct business, and if other people don't want to leave. And this is what he found out initially in 2021 when they had the elections. Muqtada Sadr was having 73 seats. He looked at it and he said, well, the Sunnis are united. They have one front. I could take them, and I go with the Kurds and go with the largest Kurdish bloc. And then the three of us can sit together and can have a coalition that will run the country, and only God is more powerful than us democratically. But he discovered that it is not so easy. So, the deep state went to the Supreme Court and said, well, let's really look at this. Can Muqtada Sadr form a coalition this way? And they blocked it's so-called, they hit the ice from the thinnest position or spot. They said, you can, of course, put any prime minister you like. You can put any president for the parliament, but you cannot have the president of the republic elected except for by 2/3 of the vote. And those three groups, Muqtada Sadr, Masoud Barzani, and Mohammed al-Halbousi, the Shia, Kurds, and Sunnis, did not have enough, did not have the 2/3. So the opposition held 1/3 or more than 1/3. And they said, well, without appointing a president, you cannot have a prime minister, you cannot form a government, you cannot do anything. So we are going to block you from, from the beginning. And they did. And it took a year. The election was in October, and it took a year to form a government in October 2022. Only after Muqtada Sadr withdrew from politics. So he decided. So he is important. He has a loyal constituency. He seems to be getting better in politics. The problem is he doesn't have the tools. No one else has the tools to govern Iraq. The only way, or the only tool you can govern Iraq with, is to have a strong coalition, and you have to compromise. And that's why it's tough. In the old days, after 2003, we had only a vertical division in Iraq. We had all the Shia, all the Kurds, and all the Sunnis in their own respective groups. Now it is more dangerous. You have still sectarian division, Shia, Sunni, and Kurd, but we also have horizontal divisions. The Shia are divided into 3 or 4 groups. The Sunnis are divided in at least 2 groups now. The Kurds are divided in 3 groups. The traditional Kurdistan Democratic Party and the Patriotic Party of Kurdistan, and then the new parties that emerged recently, and they are trying to create a place for themselves. And this is what happened, when there was a strong Shia in Muqtada Sadr, with a strong Kurd in Masoud Barzani, and a strong Sunni with Al-Halbusi. The opposition managed to find unhappy Kurds with Masoud Barzani's way of running Kurdistan, and they took them aside. They managed to find a few Sunnis who didn't like what Halbusi was doing, and they put them on their side. And with the rest of the Shia, and they had more than 1/3. If you have more than 1/3, you can cripple the country. This is the situation here. So it is. Muqtada Sadr remains important. Also with Muqtada Sadr, because of the loyalty of his followers. No matter what he says, they will never challenge his views. They will never even ask him, why are you doing this? Or, give me one leader who will tell 73 elected members of parliament to resign their job after, before even doing anything. They just spend their money. They went and spend their power and their energy and sweat and tears to gain an election. And he said, go and resign. And in 5 minutes, all the resignation were sent in one packet to the prime. It doesn't happen. Not a single one of them said, I'm not doing it. So this is important. And this loyalty, this ability to say whatever he would say and to order them whatever, whether right or wrong, and they will comply, gave him the incentive to do things that are unpredictable. And that's why you see Muqtada Sadr, if you look at him throughout his political career in post-2003, you will see that he was all over the place. He was with the issue and against it. And sometimes within 1 week or 2 weeks, he would take 3 positions opposite to one another. And his followers say, yes, that's where we are today. And that is, in a way, makes him a less reliable partner from the perspective of the other politicians. They say, well, look, I can come and sign an agreement with you, and I will create enemies for myself, only to see you tomorrow going the opposite direction. So a lot of politicians, while they like Muqtada Sadr, they are too afraid of the risk of putting their eggs in his basket. And he says, look, people like Masoud Barzani, like Halbusi, I say, I'd rather work with Maliki because I know what I will get. I know I will get 40% of what I want, 30% of what I want, but I'm guaranteed this 40%. But with Muqtada Sadr, I could sleep the night with 100%.
Thank you for this insight.
And in the morning, next question.
Our next question is, we have talked about internal aspect with Muqtada al-Sadr politically wise, and we've talked about Iran, the US. Maybe we can talk a little bit about the Iraqi's debts, not only from state to state or the UN resolution, but more about international firms. We know that Iraq has kind of some debts regarding them. Do you know how the order is helping Iraq to maybe pay back or to protect Iraq to pay the debts? Or do you think that the order is like challenging for them? I don't know if the question makes sense.
No, it's a good question. Look, you know, the invasion of Kuwait and also the policies of Saddam Hussein's regime created an atmosphere that made Iraq viewed negatively around the world, to the point where any claim against Iraq becomes credible, even if it's not. Okay, so that's a problem. And many people took advantage of this, and they abused this position, and they began to raise wild claims against the country. But some companies do have legitimate claims. Okay, and the order is viewing both these issues. Or not the order, the language of the order is very simple. It's just how the order was implemented. You know, the order doesn't go into details. But the US government, in implementing the order, is doing this. First, it is trying to protect Iraq against unfounded claims, because, you know, especially what the UN did when they ordered the reparations for Kuwait and all of the other parties that were damaged from the invasion of Kuwait. They did not ask for any verifications. You go and put any amount of money, you say, this is what I lost, and the UN says, yes, this is what you lost, and Iraq has to pay it. To point where, again, the UN was really, and that's, the UN has been in the way it handled Iraq, it was really atrocious. And here I'm, you know, I'm trying to be objective, but I also will have to be, you know, yes, I'm an Iraqi, but on the other hand, you know, the first time ever two countries have their border drawn without one side sitting at the table. It was the UN and Kuwait decided where the border is. No single map historically would put the border where it is that the UN has put it. And Iraq had to say yes, because Iraq had no power to do anything. And Saddam Hussein didn't care. He wanted to survive. And he looked the other way. So many other issues, and including those reparations. And Iraq paid, you know, again, what was specified in those resolutions. But there are others that keep coming. So the US government looks at that. And on the one hand, I don't think that they feel guilty. This is not something on their dictionary. But they know and they realize that they were the leading power in running that UN onslaught on Iraq. And they are trying to take some of that back, because they realize, because of their actions or the actions they led in the UN Security Council, Iraq began to receive claims that are so wild, no one can believe. But also, on the other hand, what do you do with the claims that are legitimate? And that is the harder question from the resolution. It's easy to go and say, well, look, somebody is sitting and saying, oh, I don't know, I have a friend who was slapped on the face and I felt bad and I need reparations for it. I'm just making up a scenario. But someone who really lost assets or lost business, or they entered in a contract with the Iraqi government and that was severed, legitimate claims. And the US balanced those legitimate claims against Iraq's ability to rebuild itself. If Iraq ends up paying every single penny that is there, first of all, no country pays every single penny they owe. So many countries default and time and again, and the world forgives them. You know, and when we could look at so many countries that have been defaulting. But on the other hand, Iraq is in a particular situation because you are trying to bring this country from being a pariah state, a bad actor, to becoming a good actor, you need to give them an incentive to become a good actor. It's just like you have a friend in the group who is acting in a not good way, and you want to, if you keep rebuking them and talking to them tough, etc., you are pushing them away. You need to bring them in, even if it means that you make some sacrifices. So the U.S. government, in implementing this resolution, is trying to say, look, we need to let the Iraqis feel that their cooperation pays off, that they get something out of it. If it was one way to basically only Iraq pays, why should they cooperate? Also, Iraq has limited resources, and Iraq has tremendous needs. The bill for reconstruction of Iraq is north of $500 billion. Okay, that is cash that you need to put in to rebuild from the invasion of the US and the damages from the terrorism that took over from 2003 all the way to 2017, 18. The ISIS itself and what it did. Until now, there are cities in Iraq that are sitting in ruins. Mosul, for example, is, in certain sections, it's like you are in Gaza today. So many other places. These were carpet bombs. Until now, there are entire neighborhoods with people who are IDPs, internally displaced people, or refugees elsewhere, who cannot go back because they can't go. There is no home to go back to. The economy in Iraq still needs a lot of money. I mean, I mentioned earlier what I wrote with both Deputy Prime Minister Ali Alawi and Minister Luay Khatib. We were all out of government when it was written, the manifesto that I mentioned earlier. We estimated that Iraq needed to raise its GDP to somewhere around $500 billion initially, and then move it up every year to be able to meet the challenges, the economic challenges they have. Which means what? Iraq right now has about 250-ish GDP, $250 billion. Iraqi revenue from oil, which is, again, at a $70 or $8 a barrel, all of it is somewhere around $80 billion a year. Okay. And it is a very volatile commodity. Just in 2020, it was trading for minus. You paid people to take your oil. Okay. You don't know. I mean, it went down to $20. To break even, just to operate the government, Iraq needs oil to continue to be at $80 or $75 at least a barrel, cannot go down. And then there should be no interruption of production. So basically, that's what it is. In order to do it, you really need to get, these are hard numbers. The Iraqi government right now is about 90% made out of oil revenues. So if anything happens to the oil, whether prices go down or whether it is the production for some reason is interrupted, Hormuz is closed because of a war, or Hormuz Strait, which is, what that is. And then, or some terrorist activity happens, and whatever it is, Iraq has no other option to do it. There are 8 million Iraqis who receive paychecks every month from the government. Okay. So what Iraq needs to do is really to activate other sectors to diversify its economy. And not only that, because right now the government is the only employer that is available. And every year, about 800,000 people enter the job market. And the government, all of them want jobs from the government. Iraqi government is saturated, actually oversaturated now. It's about 3 times the international average of public employees to civilian population ratio. No country, and there are 40 million Iraqis. We are going to 50 million very soon. So this is not something the government can sustain. Now, if all of your revenues are barely enough to run the government, pay salaries, how are you going to build and get those, things that need about $5 billion to rebuild? How are you going to activate an economy, to create a vibrant economy? You need to put cash to get cash. And Iraq is not doing this. So if you, on top of that, you come to Iraq and say, this money, which is barely enough to pay salaries, now we are going to make you pay this company and that company and this country and that country. They have no money. They don't have it. It's simple. It's just like in your personal budget. You have your salary, you get the rent has to be paid, you get the groceries have to be paid, you get the bills have to be paid, phone, electricity, this and that. These are mandatory. You have to pay them. There is no other way. And someone comes to you and says, no, don't pay those. Give me first, on top, something that I claim that you owe me. And then at the end of the day, if you pay that person, you end up not paying your rent. They will throw your stuff out. You're not going to pay your phone bill. They will cut it off. You're not going to have electricity. You're not going to have water. You will not survive. So the way to do it is you cannot tell the phone company to give you free phone service. You cannot tell the landlord to give you rent free. You can always tell the person who says, you owe me money, I will give you when I have money. Okay. Other than that, this is the way. So Iraq is exactly like this. And the United States is using this order. That's the importance of the order. Now, this is, again, the carrot for Iraq. The stick, of course, is that Iraq cannot tell the US no. Not only on the issues related to the order, but on other issues. Because you always are afraid that if a US president becomes mad with you, like Trump, for example, or someone, even Biden for that matter, or some other official, and they say, the heck with Iraq. All of a sudden, if this is lifted, then you see yourself exposed, in US courts and international courts and the UN Security Council. You go back to the days of Saddam Hussein, because the world is already, everybody loves Iraq now, and they have no enemies. But if the US starts, something, or they don't have to start anything, they just tell you, I'm not going to send you dollars. And that's enough to cripple Iraq and have it on its knees. So the order has both sides. It has the protection when Iraq is behaving well, but it has the other potential if Iraq doesn't behave. And behave is not always, it's in the eye of beholders. What the US says good behavior is good behavior. And that's why Iraqis are always, they take those protections, but they take it with a bitter taste, because they come at an expense. This is not a free protection.
Thank you for this answer. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. And I think on that note, you've been very gracious with your time, and you're so knowledgeable on the topic that it's given us so much valuable information. And I know that we certainly are going to benefit from it, as well as our readers. And we hope to maybe have the opportunity to benefit you from your expertise in the future as well. It's been an absolute pleasure to be able to listen to you, and we hope that you enjoy the rest of your holiday.
Well, you are very kind. Thank you very much, ladies, for this interview, for also the opportunity to chat with you. Who knows?